This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
On Kentucky Afield Radio, we love a green world.
It might be green, but that doesn't mean it's good.
That's the first time you've ever heard that said on this show. Just because it's green doesn't mean it's good. We go inside outdoors to see what's out there, what shouldn't be, and what's missing. What's wrong with the greenery in this scenery? We'll have the answers next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
Hi, I'm Sadie. When I was born in '94, so was an idea: Kentucky Nature license plates. Over the years, they've featured butterflies, hummingbirds, and 2 words: nature's finest. These plates have helped safeguard more than 80,000 acres of wilderness areas, a number that's grown as I have, and I can't wait to see what's down the road. See with me. Next time you renew, choose a nature plate, and pick the plate that keeps the bluegrass green.
How was the wedding?
I cried like a baby.
Good thing you wore your life jacket.
They say you can drown in a teaspoon of water. Makes you think twice about that next cup of coffee.
Honey, I'll be outside washing the car.
Life jacket.
Before you break a sweat, before your next sad movie, wear your life jacket.
Put on your life jacket and help with the dishes.
Dad.
Life jackets. You know when they're a stupid idea. You should know when they're not. Kentucky conservation officers remind you your life jacket's got your back. Welcome to Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. There is a lot to be said for permanence. The one who is steadfast and true as the world changes around you. Longevity in a job. It gives you a perspective that few others have, and it supports the fact that you have helped to guide and maybe even write a chapter of history. While we love our fast-paced lifestyle, we hold a place in our heart for permanence, for people and things that have stood the tests of time. For those who love wildflowers and the plant life that define our state, the name Joyce Bender is known to many, and it has been for a long time. In 1986, she first took the reins as the overseer of Kentucky's nature preserve system. A nature preserve is more than just woodland acreage or a green space. A nature preserve signifies the best remaining natural areas in the state, and in a Kentucky that is growing by leaps and bounds, it is her job to keep them that way.
When I came here, I knew all kinds of plants, and I was expected to help with the botanical end of things and also look after the 16 nature preserves. Well, getting into that work, I realized that, boy, these only 16, but they still needed a lot of attention, and there was only me. It really became clear to our director at the time and me that more attention needed to really just be spent on the preserves. And then we started to acquire more. In 1990, there was an appropriation for the first time. The legislature saw fit to give us money to buy land. Prior to that time, in 1976, when the law that brought us into being was enacted, it was go out and find these nature preserves, but good luck figuring out how to acquire them because there was no appropriation. And so we used Land and Water Conservation Fund monies, and we had some things that were donated to the state. Our first nature preserve was donated to the state. So it was, in those early days, pretty hard to come up with the funds to really support having staff, too. I had a seasonal in 1989, and then I didn't get full-time employees until 1996. So 10 years after taking on the role, I didn't have any staff that were permanent. I had some really great seasonal staff through those years. But
the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission has never been known for having a huge staff.
We don't have a huge staff, but every one of our staff members has an enormous heart and enormous drive to do the best they can do. And that's, I think, what's also made me want to be there all these years, is that my colleagues have always done what it took to get it accomplished. And I'm very proud of the work that we have done through the years.
So you've done more with less and worn a lot of hats in the process. And it has to have been a fun career. You came up with something, I think, many years ago, and it struck me as novel. Because I'm in advertising, I'm in communications. What's wrong with the greenery in this scenery? I remember you saying that on a Kentucky Afield television shoot eons ago. Did you write that?
Well, every once in a while, you'll have a little moment where you actually come up with something that kind of strikes a chord. And I did come up with that because when I thought about it, I was making a presentation to garden clubs and other groups about invasive species, which I've done since 1991 on a regular basis. It just seemed catchy, and it also brought to light the fact that when people look out the window, they're just seeing greenery, and they think that's a beautiful scene out there, and, all is well. If you see, the plants wilting or the grass is browning, nobody likes to see that in the scenery. But as long as it's green, it's great. So my job was to point out the fact that it might be green, but that doesn't mean it's good. And if you just have greenery and you aren't hearing birds, and you're not seeing butterflies, and you're not seeing all the myriad life that's supported by native greenery in our state, there's something wrong with that. And so if the greenery outside the window is, a tree of heaven, and the understory is Japanese grass and bush honeysuckle, that's not going to support very much in the way of native wildlife, and we're going to be much poorer for that.
When you say the greenery and the scenery, is it just scenery? Is it scenery everywhere? Is it limited to one nature preserve or one creek bed, or is it uniform?
Unfortunately, you can go around our planet now and find things that don't belong. And, when you're talking about invasive exotic species, we're talking about those that have been moved by human beings on purpose or by accident to a location where they did not naturally occur. And so when they get there, the bug that ate them back in their native country is not present, so they don't have any of the species chewing on them, boring into their roots, making it so that they don't proliferate rapidly, like our native species. If you look at anything that's native, there's a caterpillar on it, there's some other kind of insect boring into it, and that's the natural check and balance of the environment, where species that belong in that system don't overwhelm it. If you go to China, where kudzu is from, it's not draping the trees and choking houses. It's acting like it should, because there's native root-boring species that don't allow it to just run amok. But when these things get moved to our country, or things from our country get moved to another country, there's nothing there that is native that recognizes it as food. And so it gets to grow for many years absolutely unabated, and it has more competitive edge over our native species. And so it becomes the bully.
So what if you brought its natural predator, its natural enemy here, too? Then what do we get into? You
can get into some trouble, because that has occurred. And a prime example of biological control that has run amok, and we have the nodding thistle that is on roadsides around Kentucky. It's that big spiny-looking purple head that nods on the side of I-64 or any other road that's got limestone as the substrate. It's in pastures, and it gets into natural areas. And so the government decided, well, let's find a bug from where this plant is from that eats it there, and we'll introduce it here. So they found a weevil that does a really good job, and it eats the heads of the thistle, and it doesn't allow it to produce seed. But it also goes after our native thistles, and we have a number of species that require the native thistle to be present. So when that happens, and this non-native weevil now is eating them too, the native species lose out. So you've got to be really mindful that bringing in an invasive to fight an invasive can have unexpected circumstances, and that is definitely one that has kind of gone awry in the United States.
It's a shame that ecosystems around the world just don't intermingle and get along with each other and play nice. And why then would our animals here not say, hey, something new on the menu? Let's go over and take a bite out of that and see if we like it.
Well, sometimes that does occur, and it takes generations and generations. And some of these things, privet is a really good example. Chinese privet came over here in the 1850s, and it didn't really become a pest until the 1950s and 60s. And there's a lag time sometimes with these species where they have to adjust to their new home. And then, there's some triggering mechanism that allows them to all of a sudden just run rampant. And if you look in Kentucky, we're having a problem with privet in a number of places. But if you're driving around northern Georgia, the mid-story in most forests now is privet. There's circumstances that allow this thing to become established, but then there's something else that triggers it to become this colossal species running amok.
We need to take a break, then back with more on the changes in the plant life across our state. Some may be as close as your backyard flower garden. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. For protecting our fields and our woodlands, it's a big job, and several state agencies have a hand in the process, and they include the Division of Forestry, the Kentucky Wild Rivers Program, Kentucky State Parks, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and my guest's agency, the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission. Over the years, I've interviewed experts from all of them. And the thread that sews them all together is our wildlife's reliance on the trees, the plants, the nuts, the berries. They need them to be just as native to the Kentucky countryside as the animals are themselves. Joyce Bender, for something as perfect as nature, why is it that people still feel like they have to tamper with it?
Before the start of the show, we were talking about how there's an appeal to things that are not around here, and you want to be the first on your block with the new shrub or the new flower and have everybody go, wow, you're just so avant-garde with your gardening. And there is an appeal, and I understand that, but I think we all have a responsibility to ask the nurseryman, is this thing going to run out of my yard and invade my neighbors or, go to the nature preserve down the street and cause trouble? We're all responsible for our environment, and I think we all need to have a bigger role in making wise decisions about what we have in it.
I remember as a little boy, and my mother would take me to Louisville, and we were on Interstate 71. They had just built the interstate. There were areas that didn't have any plant growth on it, just that needed some kind of a plant so that roots would get in there and hold the dirt in place. And she said they brought this plant over that will do that. It'll just creep along and it just stays right there, and it really does a good job of holding the mud to the rocks kind of thing.
There are a number of species that are used on roadsides to help hold soil, and crown vetch is one that is used. And right now, it's kind of in its glory because we've had such a cool, wet spring up until just now. A lot of these Eurasian species that are at the latitude that, your spring is a cold and wet one, are doing really well. Some years it does well, but other years it does outstanding. And, that's something the Transportation Cabinet uses throughout, this part of the country anyway that I know of, to help hold banks in place. And you don't want the roadside to cave in and rocks to come down on cars, and so something has to be done. But that stuff doesn't just stay on the roadside, and it has actually entangled itself into one of our state's most endangered species, the Short's goldenrod, up around Blue Licks area on the roadsides there on US 68. A lot of that has left the roadside and has gone into the nature preserve that's there, and that's a real troublesome weed to get rid of.
Is that exotic, invasive from another country?
Yes. It's not native to our country, and again, it's one of those things that nothing really eats on it. You'll never see deer sitting there grazing on it to any great extent that I've ever seen, or cattle. If it moves into a pasture, it's not like cows eat it. So you mow it, and you try to spray it, but the leaves are real narrow, and when it gets hot, they kind of close up on themselves, so it's worthless to try and spray that with herbicide at that time because you don't have the leaf surface to absorb it. So that's a really troublesome one for us. So people, well-meaning as they are the problem. These seeds don't just get on a plane and come here on their own. This reminds me of a story, and we'll want to keep talking about what people are doing to bring other plants to Kentucky and spread them around the globe where they really shouldn't be going. There was a story in June 2015 about
Johnny Depp was going to Australia to do a movie. He took 2 dogs with him, and they quarantined those dogs because they didn't want to spread rabies into Australia. He had to send the dogs back to the United States. If you've ever been anywhere in an airplane, traveled internationally, as you come home, they will ask you, they pass around that little questionnaire. Have you been on a farm? Have you been in the woods? Do you have any fruit? Do you have any mud in your cleats? Anywhere that you would be bringing seeds back? So that just what you're talking about doesn't happen again. Can you comment on the importance of just what the everyday person can do to be aware?
Well, you don't want to shut the barn door after the horses are gone, but, we have learned from some mistakes, and so people are trying to be more careful about what does enter this country. I've had similar experiences. I was at a conference where a woman from New Zealand said she couldn't take back the unvarnished rulers that were given out with the imprinted organization's name on it, because that's not allowed. You can't bring a raw wood product back. So countries have their rules, and even the Fish and Wildlife Department has concerns and rules about animals that are imported for hunting purposes, and there's permits and all the rest of that. And so we do make strides in some realms. Certainly in agriculture, we don't want to have all these pests. There used to be the scares about med flies and other agricultural pests, because you're talking about billions and billions of dollars of someone's livelihood and abilities being at stake. So where it makes sense, we do something. And I think that the environment is just taken for granted when it comes to those kinds of impacts. The cost is in the billions to deal with invasive species that have gotten into our country. And we're talking about agricultural pests as well as forest pests that limit timber production, and even our invasive species that are harmful to natural areas. So, that's all compiled in there now together, and the cost is very high. But it's just a citizen saying, well, I don't import things. What is my role? Well, I think you need to look as close as your backyard and your front garden and say, well, I want to have something that's really got some great color, something that lasts a long time, and I'm going to go to the nursery, or I'm going to go over to Lowe's, and I'm going to look around and see what there is. While you're there, it's really important to say, will this be invasive? Will I be unhappy after one season of this thing being in my garden? And really put those questions to the people who are producing the plant life. As a citizen who's buying these things, you have the power with the dollars in your pocket to make them listen to you. When I go to speak to the big corporations who grow lots of nursery plants, it's not the same, because they look at us as like, these people. But when you're the citizen saying, I've got this money and I'm only going to spend it a certain way, they have to listen. But you're also considering the production that it takes for them to grow these species. They know how to do mass production of a set number of species. And so when you're starting to talk about some of these native species that they're not familiar with, you're asking them to take a leap of faith. So the only way that that's going to continue to happen is if the citizens are asking for those things. If they're saying, I don't want this invasive stuff that I've read about. I want you to show me that you've got native species in stock. And of course, we have some native nurseries in the state that are doing all they can. But when you're talking about the transportation cabinet, or you're talking about when forestry or fish and wildlife guys come to me and say, what can we recommend that's available commercially in large quantities for these log landings, or for when we've finished a construction project and we want to sow down the ground? And there's just not a lot of stuff commercially available in those quantities right now. I tell people, well, just use some annual rye. And a lot of the native things that have been scraped and bumped around, if they're still present in the soil, they'll start to come back in a year's time. And you've had your cover of the ryegrass to support the possibility of erosion. So if people start to think about the fact that they do have the power to change how this is done commercially, I think we could get further. But there needs to just be more people out there looking. And the late Tom Barnes certainly was trying to help with that aspect by convincing people that you could establish warm season grasses a lot quicker. And he did a lot of experimentation to try to, hasten that process along. Some of these species, because they're perennial, people want a quick fix, and so you want to sow down something that pops up in a couple of weeks and establishes quickly. And some of the native things, it takes longer, so there needs to be patience. And as Americans, we've come to want that instant gratification. We don't want to wait. So convincing people that if it takes a little longer, it's still going to be better, that's just a process to change some mindsets.
Thinking about anywhere that would sell summer plants, I remember my mama back as early as the 60s would plant marigolds, petunias, and she just loved it. Those were annuals. They didn't keep coming back year after year after year. But when you see these plants, begonias and whatnot, are they from the United States? Are they from here? Where are they from?
Well, a lot of the species that are grown for yards and home use are not from this country. Many now, there's a lot of people who do want native things, but petunias and zinnias and begonias, things like that, they don't run out of your garden and go invade the natural area next door. We have a list that we've developed. The Kentucky Exotic Pest Plant Council has worked for years with the best scholars in the state who look at plant life, and we've talked to land managers, and we've developed lists that really talk about the ones that are really seriously invasive. I'm not saying that people shouldn't have non-native things in their yard, because there are many things that are pretty benign and really don't cause issues. It's just be smart about the purchases. Look at what your impact is. We all need to consider what our impact is.
We are talking about wild plants and wild places with Joyce Bender. A fishing report is just ahead, and then something to be thinking about. Where will you find the greater percentage of native plants? Here in Kentucky? In Hawaii. We will be back on Kentucky Afield Radio. Baglin back on Kentucky Afield Radio. If this is a show you would like to hear again, or if you'd like to hear a show maybe you've missed in the past, pretty easy to find those links. First, go to our Facebook page. You can like us if you'd like, and there you'll find our weekly link. You can also go to youtube.com, put Kentucky Afield Radio in the search box, and up will pop our playlist. We've got shows in there for years now. Also find us at myhuntingandfishing.com. Plus, we are a podcast on iTunes. More with our guest, Joyce Bender, on Kentucky's native plants. It is time now for our fishing report.
In western Kentucky, down at Kentucky and Barkley Lakes, we're already into that summertime fishing pattern, man. It has got hot. There's very little discharge, only about 20,000 CFS planned for this week through Kentucky and a little less through Barkley. So crappie fishermen, they're still finding a few fish up in the embayments on the creek channels, vertical fishing, minnows and jigs, finding a few bluegill, red ears out in deeper water around stumps, maybe using a small split shot and a worm around those stumps might catch you some sunfish. As far as the riverbank, if you can find you some river current, if they turn on the generators, and the blue catfishing ought to pick up on the riverbanks. In the tailwaters, though, be good for catfish and striped bass fishing below the dams. Well, this is Paul Reister, and I hope you find a good, cool day to go fishing.
This is Rob Roll in the Northwestern Fishery District. No Lynn is holding it steady at Summer Pool. Rough River Lake is still 3.5 feet above Summer Pool. Bass fishing at both reservoirs is fair. Transition zones are really good places to be fishing right now. And try fishing those areas with some deep diving crankbaits or some Carolina rigged plastic baits. Crappie are pretty much set up on their summertime areas, the deeper brush piles, 12 to 15 foot depth range. For closer trips to home, you might check out some of our Finns Lakes in Owensboro, Davis County, as well as Madisonville City Park Lake and Bevel Park Lake in Litchfield. They've all been stocked with catfish and hybrid sunfish within the last week or two. That's an update from the Northwestern Fishery District. Please remember, be safe on the water. Always wear your PFDs.
Hi, this is John Williams with the Fishery Report for Southeast Kentucky. The fishing at Lake Cumberland has been relatively slow the last several weeks. Stripers and the bass and the crappies really slowed down with this hot weather. About the only thing biting there is catfish and channel cats and bluegill. Catch the bluegill on crickets or the channels on night crawlers or cut bait. Probably your best bet in the district would be taking a flow trip down one of the rivers in our area, either the Upper Cumberland or the Big South Fork, Buck Creek, Rock Castle River, South Fork, Kentucky, all have excellent fisheries. including smallmouth and a variety of sunfish. I like throwing rebel crawdads or curly-tailed grubs or inline spinners. Catch a variety of bass and sunfish on those. Also, this time of year, Cumberland tailwater is good. Inline spinners, small cranks, and spoons are usually the best bet there. As always, good luck and good fishing.
Who's ready for a boatload of laughs? Give it up for Funny Sonny!
Thanks. I found it. A use for a life jacket. A pillow! Hey, I'm not going to wear a life jacket. I know how to swim. How can it hurt you? It's just water.
This chick's hysterical.
Funny Sonny, everyone. She'll be here all week. Maybe.
Kentucky conservation officers remind you,
Your life jacket's got your back.
Honey, it's Dad. For Father's Day, let's just keep it simple. A Maserati would be perfect, but if you wanted to spend a little less, try the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife Gift Certificate. I can redeem it for a hunting or fishing license, and that puts me in the fast lane for what I like to do to relax this summer. Load, buy, print, online. So remember, Maserati first, then the Fish and Wildlife Gift Certificate. Or both.
Find it at fw.ky.gov.
Charlie Baglin back on Kentucky Afield Radio. We all enjoy the outdoors in different ways. I spent a day recently with a friend shooting wildflowers. And I thought to myself, what is it that I'm seeing? It's pretty, sure, but is it native? Maybe I should be doing some research on exactly what this is before I post it to Facebook and start bragging about its beauty. It may be one of those plants that biologists wish wasn't here at all. My guest today knows the difference, and she should. She's been on the job for close to 30 years now with the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission. And in some circles, Joyce, you are the guru. If you want to know what's right or if you want to know what's true, you ask Joyce. Did you know you were a superwoman?
No, because there's other botanists that have been at the agency, and I'm sure they've got asked a lot of questions that I didn't get asked. We've had really good botanists through the years at the commission.
I remember once upon a time, I did a show on mistletoe about the plants of Christmas, talking about holly and mistletoe and Christmas trees and that sort of thing. And it was you who corrected, I think, the lady that I had interviewed, that there were, 2 species of mistletoe in the state, or just one? Whatever it was, the number was wrong, and you made the correction. Mistletoe in Kentucky, how many species?
Well, now, that's where it would be better to ask one of our botanists. I think there's only the one, but I think people need to know that it is a native species, and you know, it does get on trees, it does make its home on the tree and take nutrients from the tree, but it doesn't mean that it is harmful to the tree. You know, if mistletoe was everywhere, then you'd have to start looking at that as an issue for plant health, but you know, it's a natural part of our ecosystem. I think it has to do with the fact that Christmas trees that people buy are not from here, unless they're using cedars.
What's wrong with the greenery and the scenery? I have a feeling anybody anywhere in the state looking out their window would say the scenery looks fine from here. Is it safe to say that it is mostly fine? Is it 80% fine? How much is wrong?
I guess it depends on where you are and how much disturbance has occurred in the area that you're visiting or driving through. For example, just here in Frankfort, if you go along the east-west connector in the summertime, there's a lot of trees along there, but many of them are tree of heaven. And I just cringe every time I see that. And driving around Devil's Hollow Road and other places where you're along the stream side, there's a Japanese knotweed, and that is not a native species, and that's gaining a lot of ground. You know, those are the kind of things that are just kind of scary to me, because people are driving by, and as I said before, well, it's green, that's great. But, you know, if we went to Hawaii, and we're not from there, so we don't know, half of the species that are in Hawaii are not native. And so if I went and got off the plane and looked around, I'd be sitting there going, well, this looks kind of pretty, but should I think it is?
Right.
And here in Kentucky, about 28% of the plant life that has been cataloged for the state is not native to Kentucky. That doesn't mean that all of it is harmful and that, you've got to swat every weed in your yard, but there are some that are truly damaging to the environment, impede natural processes, choke out other native species that are critical for wildlife habitat and food. It depends on where you are. I think that, how much is wrong with the scenery versus how much is good with the scenery. If you went to our Blanton Forest Preserve in Harlan County, for example, and walked into the middle of it, you could breathe a big sigh of relief, which I do, because that is in good shape. It's when we have all these little forest patches that have a lot of edge to them, where there's a lot of disruption along those edges, that things start to become problematic. Whenever we have an avenue into a landscape that it seems intact and whole by a power line, a pipeline, a road, you're bringing all the invasive species with you, and that includes animals. You've got cowbirds that can invade into interior forests and lay their eggs in warbler nests, and then our native warblers have lost the productivity of that nest because the cowbird egg hatches first and it's a bigger baby and they're feeding the bigger mouth. So you just have to consider that every intrusion, every interaction with the environment can be bad if we're not mindful of the level of disturbance that we cause. The reason that Pine Mountain is in pretty decent shape is because there's only, I think, 6 roads that cross the entire 123-mile length of it. So you've got a lot of uninterrupted forest cover, even though it's been logged. It's still fairly intact because there's not a lot of ways to intrude into that interior and bring weeds along, unless you're on an ATV or, you've got a logging truck that hasn't been cleaned in forever and it's got mud caked on it with seeds of God knows what.
In the wildlife business, there's a hero out there named Aldo Leopold, and he has this concept called tinkering. If you take something apart, Mr. Leopold said, keep all the parts. So when you put it all back together again, it works. If you're taking a clock apart, bicycle apart, make sure you keep all the parts. Have we done that? Does that apply well to plant life?
I guess I'd have to, again, think about, some case-by-case situations. That resonated in me when I was a young person reading Aldo Leopold. And I believe in the job that I've had managing the state nature preserve system. It's really important to learn as much as you can about every one of those parts, because we don't understand all the functions. And if you and I took a watch apart, a real watch where you've got springs and little cogs and gears, to understand how all of that fits in that watch and moves and functions every day for us is a big undertaking. And I think we all take the environment for granted because, the air is going in and out of our lungs and we don't have to think about it, and we drink the water out of the tap. But if we had to really start thinking about all the parts that help make that water clean enough for us to drink, and we think about why do we have good air to breathe, you've got to go back to the trees and their function in the environment and the plant life that's on the ground. And all of that has to work together. Talk about a spider's web, and if you break that web of life, they call it, are you going to be able to put all those pieces back together? Because it's a delicate balance. And we've gone so far astray sometimes, and we think we're above nature now, so we don't understand our place in it. And so we think that we can just keep fixing what's wrong. And I don't think there's a jeweler out there who can fix the watch in some instances. I think it's really a broken watch.
Seems like there may be enough plants to go around that maybe Mother Nature can fix itself. I don't know. Let me put it this way. Just because it's the 21st century doesn't mean we know everything about every plant and its relationship to every animal and bird and person. Any thought on that?
Well, I've got to say that in looking at all of these preserves for the past 29 years, it's very humbling because I feel like I've been given this gift and this responsibility to take care of these places and improve them. And I have my intellect and the intellect of others that I seek guidance from to do this. And you have instinct, and you also have observation. And, you try to put these pieces together with what's left on the landscape. It's not like it was when Daniel Boone came through the Cumberland Gap. It's never going to be like that again. And for people to say that they're recreating or restoring, I just say that I'm using the parts that are left and enhancing that and trying to make it so that those species present can continue, and that if we're lucky enough, some other species may come in that say, hey, this is good enough for us to live on now. And having this many years in one job, which is a blessing, because you can see that transformation through time. And I feel like we've gotten it right enough times that I feel comfortable continuing to attempt to do the work. And, you know, there's times where you're scratching your head saying, well, you know, why didn't that burn help this site better? Or, you know, what else can we do here? And that just, you know, kind of keeps you sharp and keeps you hungry to make it happen better. I don't think we'll ever have all the answers. And if you can't approach this work humbly and learn from it and be open to learning, I think you might find a different job to do. Nature will help get it done if you give it a chance. And some of the places we've just said, well, we're just going to be kind of hands off here and see what happens. And it is remarkable. There's a site we're working on now, and we're doing a bird banding station there. And we've not been doing it that many years, but we've owned the property long enough that there's some changes in vegetation, and we're seeing different birds starting to use it, which is very gratifying. And, you know, there's not a lot of encouragement to do this work from politicians and from the policymakers and sometimes even from the citizens. And so when you see that feedback finally from the environment itself, it gives you that buoying of your spirit that you just got to have to feel like you can continue to do this work.
Back, I can't remember the year, but there was an individual from southeastern Kentucky, and he was telling me the story about the Pacific yew. And he said the Pacific yew was considered a nuisance tree, a weed tree, sort of the bush honeysuckle of the Northwest. But they found that the bark of this tree contained Taxol, very useful in fighting cancer, ovarian cancer. And now they realize they look at the yew tree in a way they never have before. And I'm thinking that there may be any number of plants, maybe some right outside the window, we just haven't explored deeply enough into yet.
That potential is always there. You know, there's a storehouse out there that we still are trying to figure out, and there's been aspirin, there's been quinine, you know, things that have really helped people that have come from plant life, and there's no telling what else is out there. Even if we can't figure out a value that human beings can place on an animal or a plant, it's important that it's here.
It's here for a reason.
It's here for a reason that may have nothing to do with human beings, but it has a role to play. And if we start taking the cogs out of that watch, that watch isn't going to work.
Science is amazing, and it is a question we've all asked. What good is this? What do we need this for? Well, just because we don't have that answer today doesn't mean we won't know down the road somewhere. We will be back to wrap it up with our guest, Joyce Bender. Stay with us. I'm Charlie Baglin. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We are back on Kentucky Afield Radio with our final few minutes with Joyce Bender, the longtime head of the Kentucky State Nature Reserve and Natural Area System. Kentucky's Rare Plant Recognition Act, Joyce, recognizes the importance of rare plants, and it seeks to ensure that they continue on. And your commission periodically is to give status reports and suggestions toward keeping them from being further in decline. That law in itself is sort of a driving force for your commission.
Well, the whole focus of the Nature Preserves Commission is to go out and inventory the state and find these rare species of plants and animals and the natural communities that support them and protect them in a nature preserve system. So there are staff members of my agency whose job it is to go out and find these places. And we've done a pretty good job in the number of years that we've had staff out there. The work is twofold. You can continue to hunt for the things that we still don't know are present, but you also can start to work on the protection end. And certainly my career has been to protect those species on the nature preserves. And we have a number of rare plants that are truly rare. And every year, our botanists would go out and find these things that we had not seen in 100 years. And there's other botanists that are out there doing the same thing in Kentucky and in other states saying, wow, you know, I remember reading that this was known from the state, and I looked up the habitat type, and I went out and I found it. So we think we know a lot about what's out there, but that doesn't mean we stop looking, and we'll never know all of the things. And it's still a big surprise when somebody says, gosh, we found this plant. It's only been known in, Missouri and West, and now here it is in Kentucky. So because we have good colleagues out there, we continue to grow the knowledge of what is present. And we do then protect it as best we can.
You brought a brochure that talks about Kentucky's native alternatives to invasive plants.
You are looking at some people who might have an awareness already, but you're also putting that out at events where people can pick it up who maybe just, are attracted to the color for cover, and then you start talking to them about, hey, how's your garden? What do you have in your yard? And then say, why don't you look and see if any of the species that you have are on our list of species that are problematic. And then you can direct them to, well, if you do want to dig that up or you do want to cut that down, here's something else you can plant in its stead. The important thing for folks is to realize that sometimes when you do get these non-native species, you're struggling to keep them growing well. But if you have a native species that has adapted to our quirky growing conditions and our sometimes awful soils, those species are going to do well without a lot of attention from you. They're very happy to hear that because a lot of people don't have the time. They want to do gardening, but they don't have the time to fuss and tend it. So if you say, these native things can be planted and they'll do well because they're from here, they're adapted to our climate and soils, wow, great. I think I do want that because I've been struggling with this other thing. That is a way to try to draw people into a better understanding of what's available.
Where will people see this Kentucky's Least Wanted poster?
We give them out to groups to put up in nature centers to use for programming, extension offices. We do try to get them out to places, but a lot of times when you're talking about the big box stores, a lot of times, well, you have to talk to corporate about that.
Right.
And so then it goes up a chain and gets lost somewhere. So.
That can happen. Internet's a wonderful place to find it.
It is on the Internet. You can download it from there. You can download the Native Alternative brochure that you have there in your hand. Any of this is also available through the Nature Preserves Commission. I'm happy to hand them out.
naturepreserves.ky.gov.
Yes, and you can also get me at joyce.bender@ky.gov.
People a lot of times say, you're doing it wrong, but they don't bother to tell you, here's a better way to do it. Here's a way that works better. It's going to work out better for you in the long run.
Well, that's it. When I first started giving these presentations back in 1991, people said, well, all right, lady, what else do you got? And then I didn't really have a good answer because there wasn't a lot of things commercially available back in those days. Now we have a lot more to offer folks.
Any complaints whatsoever? It's been
I wish there was.
Joyous ride.
It's been a very, very good ride. I feel very, very fortunate that I was able to have this as my job. It's not everybody that is working in any job or even state government that enjoys their work so much. I think pretty much all of us do, and I know lots of Fish and Wildlife folks, and they all do. But I think we're the fortunate ones because we get to go out and work hard, but also see the response of the environment to our labors and get the citizens involved and see their response. And there's really nothing better than seeing the light bulb go on in a kid when you're out there with them and making those connections, and you hope they'll be lifelong. But I think the sad part is just the lack of funding to do even better. The commission has gotten along all these years doing well with little, and I just think, gosh, if we can do this well with so little, how much better could we do if there was better funding?
Well, let me ask you this then. You're in the plant business. You know what's right and wrong. You know what's wrong with the greenery and the scenery. Can we win the war?
I think it's really important that if you're committing to doing this, you can't stop. You have to really be in it for the long haul. You can make great strides and big differences in how local environments respond and come back from being infested. But it is not an easy battle. It's very costly. In the larger landscape, there are places that are going to remain lost. There's just no way to make those changes. But if you look at areas such as the nature preserves, which are supposed to be these representative examples of our natural landscapes, that's where we can make that stand. My whole goal in working for the commission has been to maintain that standard, on a scale where people can take off a bite and chew it. You can eat an elephant. You can do this. It just, one bite at a time. But just keep eating. You can't say, well, I'm done, I'm tired of this, because all that work will eventually be for naught. So you got to keep working.
Well, good luck to you.
Thank you, sir.
In one way you can help the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission is by choosing a Kentucky Nature license plate. The plates with the butterfly, the cardinal, and the bobcat on them, they all three say Nature's Finest on the bottom. When you buy a nature plate, that puts money in a special fund to buy and protect our state's scenic areas, and the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission is a partner in that fund. Think about it the next time you renew. As a final thought, stop mowing your yard, or at least part of it, maybe a back corner. In a week or 2 or 3, you'll be surprised at what springs forth out of the ground and attracts hummingbirds, bees, butterflies, wildflowers that add life and color, wildflowers you used to call weeds. We are out of time. This is Charlie Baglin inviting you to join us in a week, and we'll go inside outdoors again, here on Kentucky Afield Radio.